All right, let's dig into this. Okay, so the Essential Caregivers Act of 2024, first of all, is a collaboration of the work of 4 legislative offices. We had 2 House members, 2 senators, 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats. This is what's sometimes referred to as a Four Corners bill. And we're fortunate that Senator Blumenthal insisted back in 2021 that if he was going to be on board, this is the structure he wanted to work within. The authors released a statement. We included that on this slide here, but this statement was released on their one-pager, and we've included that. It demonstrates their commitment to people in long-term care and an understanding of the cruelty of the isolation protocols that they endured, but also the need to make sure we don't lose sight of safety and infection control. And we believe that this bill strikes that balance. At the end of the production, there's a slide that'll have a link, and you'll be able to access the author's one-pager from that. Having said all that, this bill, like all bills, is a process, and nothing is final until it's final. And until it's filed. Even then, it gets debated in committees and is marked up. We believe this bill is very close to final form and very close to being ready for introduction, which is why we want to let each of you know about it. However, there are some areas where better and best case options are still being explored. Next slide, Carrie. Carrie, next slide. Okay, so the reason this bill is necessary, a resident's right to in-person access was formalized in the 1987 Nursing Home Reform Act. This is a federal law. It says the resident has a right to immediate access by family subject to the resident's consent. It also requires that the facility provide immediate access under the act to other people besides family members subject to reasonable restrictions. And of course, also the resident's consent. And when I say resident, I mean, or the resident's representative if the resident's unable to make that decision. This was put in place not only for mental and physical health and well-being of residents, but also for their protection. But not until the COVID-19 infection control protocols has this right ever been paused. The very people that residents were guaranteed access to were not even considered essential in 2020. The 1987 Nursing Home Reform Act also says that the facility, must provide reasonable access to individuals providing health, social, legal services. And many of those people, like ombudsmen, were not even considered essential for a very long time. This bill is necessary so that if a time comes, for whatever reason, that in-person access is generally denied, there's at least a portion of that right to 24/7 in-person access preserved. This bill does not create a new right. This bill preserves a portion of a right that residents are already entitled to under federal law. Next slide, Carrie. Okay, so we, Caregivers for Compromise, obviously had several goals as we worked on this bill, but we were also working with 4 individual legislators, and they each had their own personal objectives. Our primary objective was real simple. We want residents to have the right to in-person access in the event we experience another situation where Health and Human Services waives the right to 24/7 visitation. But we also want to make sure that the bill provisions were not subject to Section 1135 waivers under the Social Security Act, and we wanted to address some issues with some essential caregiver legislation already in place in certain states. For example, some states have legislation that only kicks in if a state or local authority establishes an emergency, but it doesn't apply to a federally one, and vice versa. There is a state that actually allows the facility to decide if the resident will be aware enough to benefit from an essential caregiver visit prior to even approving that visit. And they can deny visits for residents that they decide won't benefit from that. And they can deny visits for residents whom they decide may become agitated. That basically gives them the ability to prevent visits to most people with any kind of advanced form of dementia, because we all know how agitated they can become. So our goals centered around those kinds of things. Next slide, Carrie. We've included an explanation of what Section 1135 waivers are. And let me remind you, these slides are all available for download, so you don't have to rush to write all this down. You'll be sent a link. So Don't worry about missing any of this. While this waiver to the 24/7 visitation right, like other waivers, was meant to be very specific, and it was meant to be temporary in response to an immediate danger, it went on for far too long and was far too broadly applied. And there wasn't a whole lot of oversight on how that was applied. And it was not until November 12, 2021, did CMS finally reinstate the provision that says all visits must be allowed at all times. And I know that date because that was the date of my mother's memorial service. So from March 13, 2020 to November 12, 2021, in-person access was restricted. Next slide. Are we on slide 6? Okay. In addition to our goals, each legislator had certain things they wanted in the bill and certain things they wanted that bill to accomplish. And they didn't necessarily share all of that with us, but we are aware of certain things. We're extremely fortunate to have seasoned and senior legislative officers that worked on this bill. And they also took time to educate us about the process and the development of the proposed bill language. These goals were very specific. One of the main ones was they wanted to preserve states' authorities. This was an extremely high priority. They also wanted broad language that would allow the state's legislation to work under the bill. They wanted broad language that allowed long-term care facilities to put policies in place under that state legislation that would fit those unique communities. And most importantly, they wanted a bill that would pass. They wanted a bill that was going to actually get through the process, and they know what it takes to do that. Next slide, Carrie. We were made aware, part of our education process was we were made aware that there are several kinds of bills that go before Congress, many of which waste time and our tax dollars. The most common mistake made is filing bills that are everything you want and hope for, or they're filed simply to make a point. But these bills are too unlikely to pass, and they far too likely die in committees. They're possible, but they're highly unlikely. Another kind of bill is the plausible bill, which is the more realistic ask. Maybe it'll pass, maybe it won't. It has some support because it's plausible, but it still doesn't move. The third kind of bill is the one we've been working on, and that's the one that is passable. What these 4 legislators want and have promised us is they are trying to write one that will pass. This requires a lot of work and time on their part, and sometimes even more than one congressional session. We don't want that to happen, but realistically, it is a possibility. All right, next slide, Carrie. We've been in all 3 of these places as we've been working on the bill we're at now. The bill Congresswoman Tenney filed in the 117th Congress was a good bill, and the idea was met with a lot of support from many legislators who signed on as co-sponsors, but it was a possible bill, not a passable bill. We didn't realize at the time how prescriptive it actually was and how impossible it would be to get that bill past CMS and past HHS, much less past industry stakeholders. Learning from that 2021 bill, work on this bill in 2022 and 2023 continued and was more realistic and more plausible, but legislators would not file a bill that was not passable. That was their priority this time around. So back and forth the bill went, and we only know some of the stakeholders who had input, but we do know that we had 4 very distinct offices, the 2 senators, the 2 House representatives, the 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats, and all their legislative councils. And each draft that came back to us got us a little closer to becoming passable. What we are showing you today is a very good bill and a passable bill. And of course, no, it is not perfect, but y'all, perfect does not pass. Next slide. Okay, who has actually looked at this bill? As constituents and advocates, we have not been privy to all the information we wish we were given. I wish we knew exactly who has seen and commented on the bill as it went back and forth, but we simply don't know everyone who has seen it. However, we do have some good ideas, and they dropped us a lot of hints. We know staff members from both House Representatives' office. We know staff members from both Senators' office. We know all their legislative councils saw it. We do know CMS has seen this bill and given input. We do know HHS has seen this bill and given input. We do know a lot of stakeholders, committee members, and other legislators have seen it, but We don't have any idea what their input was or exactly who those people were. And then we do know that it's been seen by some other people, whoever their staff and councils chose to share it with. Those opinions, edits, suggestions were taken from people other than us. But I want to say this, we were fortunate that National Consumer Voice was among those who saw the bill. They helped develop our findings. They made suggestions and edits to the bill, all of which we accepted. They were all very reasonable and they were all very good suggestions. We're grateful to them. Lori, Sam, if y'all are both on, thank you. National Consumer Voice for Quality Long-Term Care continues to be supportive of this bill, and they continue to work for the welfare and improvement of the lives of people living in long-term care facilities, and we all owe them a debt of gratitude. Next slide. Oh, you're there. Okay. How how the federal legislation works, most of you, some of you, I don't know, may be familiar with it, but a lot of us here are unfamiliar with how all these levels of legislation actually fit together, because some of comments I've gotten are, well, but if the state bill, it conflicts. Not necessarily. We may not all be familiar with how they fit together. Your state, like mine, may already have an essential caregiver statute. As a general rule, states can make their laws more prescriptive and stricter, but not less prescriptive than federal bills, but that's not always the case. Some bills are constructed differently, but that is how it works here, since we're dealing with the Social Security Act. When I led student government tours, I used an overly simplistic example. Hope this doesn't insult anybody, but an overly simplistic example of how this pyramid could work. Suppose Congress passed a law that said we've got a vitamin deficiency, everybody must eat more vegetables. But the state of XYZ decided their population particularly needed green vegetables. So they restricted theirs to more green vegetables. Well, then they could enhance that law. And then locals under whatever community defined it even further and said that those green vegetables must include a certain vegetable like green beans or peas. It's just levels of government working within each other. Well, that's kind of how this is designed to work. There's a broad bill, states can be more restrictive, and then facilities can put policies in place under that. They don't have to, it can stay the same, but they do have that ability to do that. Again, that was a goal of the legislators broadly, to allow states to work underneath this bill and facility policies to work under those states. Next slide, Carrie. Okay, the facilities the bill would apply to are those that receive Medicare and Medicaid funding. Those are the facilities that are subject to federal regulation and oversight under the Social Security Act. And this list is the facility that those apply to. You'll notice that it specifies both Medicaid nursing facilities and Medicare skilled nursing facilities. This is because under the Social Security Act, they are defined two different ways based on funding and level of care. And we've gone ahead and in the next couple of slides provided you the definitions of both of those, just so you can see how those are worded. We know the slides are wordy, but we did go ahead and provide those for you in case you want to download those later. All right, next slide. And the next. We should be on 14. All right, so basics for essential caregivers. Essential caregivers are not supplemental staff or required to do any tasks as a condition of access, although sometimes the presence of an essential caregiver could actually be beneficial to the staff. I know that it did help the staff when I fed my mother, but I was not required to feed my mother. When the proposed bill speaks of infection control standards, it speaks specifically that the requirements will be no more restrictive than the safety protocols applicable to staff members. That does not mean they must be the same. It means that a state has the ability to require less strict standards for essential caregivers, and or a facility can put less restrictive policies in place. So for example, there may be occasions when the standards are identical, like all employees and all essential caregivers must wash hands. And then there are other occasions when the requirements would be different, like employees enter certain doors and essential caregivers enter through other doors. And there have to be some ability for them to change things like this, since essential caregivers are not there for 12-hour shifts every single day. And we do need to allow facilities to put policies in place that are unique to their level of staffing and the configuration of their building and how the administration of their organization works. Each resident or resident representative may designate at least one essential caregiver. Not all residents have the mental capacity to make that determination on their own, but they're entitled to an essential caregiver. The facility does not get to force on the resident the person of their choice. They don't get to say, I don't like your choice, choose somebody else. And if the resident can't choose that essential caregiver, the resident representative will do that. The essential caregiver designation may be amended at any time for various reasons. There are all kinds of reasons why they need to be changed. And a resident or representative may want to change that essential caregiver. Maybe one moves away, or they've got multiple siblings and they need to take turns. Who knows? There's lots of reasons why you can't just require, or you shouldn't just require one and never allow that to change. Essential caregivers must follow safety and infection control policies put in place by the facility. It has never been our position at Caregivers for Compromise with any of our organizations to just throw the doors open without any consideration of infection control. Having said that, it is also true that nobody has a more vested interest in keeping loved ones safe than us. In Texas, we put comprehensive essential caregiver guidelines into our emergency visitation rules in September of 2020. From then until the end of June 2021, when we actually stopped contact tracing, only one essential caregiver had ever brought COVID-19 into any of our almost 4,000 facilities, while hundreds of staff members did. And y'all, this is not a condemnation on the staff who are in the building all day, every day, but rather this is evidence that essential caregivers want to protect the health and safety of our loved ones in long-term care facilities. Nobody has a more vested interest in that than us. And I don't know if I mentioned this, but in Texas, our assisted living facilities must meet the requirements of the essential caregiver statute. They fall within our essential caregiver guidelines. This bill does not apply to private pay assisted living facilities, but in Texas, it does. It applies to all our nursing facilities, our intermediate care facilities, and our private pay assisted living facilities. So our almost 4,000 facilities in that 8-month period, one essential caregiver brought in disease. An essential caregiver who fails to comply with policies can be denied visitation, but only after a warning and an opportunity to correct the non-compliant issue or behavior. The reality is there will always be people who refuse to follow policy. I personally have never seen any because essential caregivers have always been so grateful to actually get in because they were denied access for so long. But facilities must have the ability to prevent an essential caregiver from doing unauthorized things that endanger everyone. Wandering into a hot zone looking for extra diapers, or entering the kitchen without authorization, doing those things that endanger not just the resident, but also the staff member and the other essential caregivers in the building. So it is really important that they be able to require essential caregivers to comply with policies that fit the needs of their own communities. Any access denial can be appealed, and it is incumbent on that facility to prove the legal justification for such denial. They don't get to deny access because they don't like you, or there's some kind of personality dispute, or it's inconvenient because of their janitorial schedule. There has to be a qualified legal justification for denying an essential caregiver access. Essential caregivers are allowed in at all times, and that burden of proof is on the facility. Why? Because like I said, under federal law, they have a 24/7 right to in-person access, and we are not creating something new here. We are preserving a piece of that federal 24/7 right to access. Essential caregivers provide whatever degree and type of assistance the resident and/or essential caregiver determine is needed. That can be emotional, physical, companionship, daily living. They're not staff members. So if they want to go in and just watch a loved one sleep, and that loved one is wholly unaware they're even there. My mother had advanced Alzheimer's. There were times I just sat there and watched her sleep. That's the business of the essential caregiver and the resident, and there is merit in that visit. Nobody gets to decide that your essential caregiver visit does not have merit. Nobody gets to demand that you feed them or you bathe them or you clean the bathroom or you straighten up their room or do their laundry in order to be allowed to visit them. There are no conditions. That resident has a right to in-person access to their essential caregiver. Next slide, Carrie. Okay, this is another probably overly simplistic diagram, and I apologize for that, of the major elements of the bill, and I'll break those down one at a time. When I was a kid, we diagrammed sentences in English class, so that's probably why I did this way. It's kind of like that, or maybe you can consider this kind of like is anyone here old enough like me to remember when we did Cliff Notes in literature? I think now they call them Spark Notes. Well, anyway, this is your cheat sheet. So you can refer back to this, but I'm going to take these one at a time as well. Next slide, Carrie. Like I said earlier, this bill is both bicameral and bipartisan. As we go through the elements, we want you to keep that in mind because it required so very much cooperation and compromise in the development of this piece of legislation, because it came from such very distinct ideologies and different areas of the country. And they did this because these types of bills have the very best chance of surviving committees, of being accepted by stakeholders, and of moving forward. And that's what our residents of long-term care need, a passable bill that protects them from isolation protocols. Yeah, I already covered all that. Okay, next slide. All right. So like I said earlier, it specifically requires that each resident gets one essential caregiver. And as this is the whole purpose of the bill, we want to just mention again, this is broadly worded language designed to allow states to require more restrictive provisions if they want. So they can choose to leave this as it is, or a state can require 2 essential caregivers. Or they can say the requirement is 1, but in the case of a medical emergency or an end of life situation or something like that, you're required to let in whole families. I mean, it is up to the states whether they want to leave it like it is and remain silent, or they want to put in additional qualifications for additional essential caregivers to come in at certain times. Next slide, we should be on number 18. Okay, another thing Caregivers for Compromise really wanted was to make sure that this bill applies to federal, state, and local emergencies. Since there are so many variations of bills out there in various states that apply only to federal or state. Y'all, when we adopted these bills, we only knew what we knew. We didn't know that if we said in a federal emergency, you have to let us in, there would be communities that would have a state emergency and they'd be like, oh, sorry, your bill doesn't apply, it's a state emergency. But we need to have consistency because this is a federal right being denied. So what we have seen in the various discontinuations, removing, abridging, and denying of a federal right in that 24/7 in-person access, we want consolidated so that it's the same for everybody, regardless what state you're in. And this bill makes sure that it takes effect regardless whether your county puts a restriction on it, whether your state puts a restriction on it, or whether the federal government puts a restriction on it. This section does not enable any new authority for a community to lock facilities down. It does the opposite. It says if there is any kind of local, state, or federal lockdown, this bill still applies and essential caregivers have to still be let in. Next slide, Carrie. Okay, nope. We should be on 19. Okay. One of the other things we really wanted to see was an application to all types of declared emergencies, not just health emergencies. That means if it's national security, or earthquakes, floods, wildfires, mudslides, alien invasion, zombie apocalypse, it doesn't matter. Whatever the emergency is, that essential caregiver is still entitled to enter that facility. essential caregivers are a new concept, and when many states put legislation in place, it did not occur to us that we might be isolated for other reasons than a pandemic. We were in pandemic mode, but lockdowns have been normalized. We have seen facilities shutting down for water main breaks. No visitors, we have a water main break. We have a new roof installation, no visitors for 3 days. We have mold under the sink, sorry, no visitors. Outbreaks of scabies, broken air conditioners, and y'all, in my own state, where we already have essential caregiver guidelines, we have a constitutional amendment. You cannot lock us out, but this autonomous attitude is still prevalent. In my own state, we had facilities that chose on their own to prevent visitation because there was a protest in the public street. They don't have the right to do that. HHS is the only one that has the right to say you can lock down a facility. However, even so, the essential caregiver is still allowed in that building. All right, next slide. Okay, this is the section that gives many of us a little heartburn to think about it, but it's not what it looks like at first glance. There are times when essential caregiver visits can be paused for up to 7 days. This can be necessary during an evacuation, when a facility is under a wildfire threat, when there is a structural damage due to a tornado or earthquake or whatever. But this is one of those areas we mentioned is still being looked at to make sure both resident safety and protection from isolation protocols strikes a balance. Under this section, a facility could restrict access for one initial period up to 7 days, and then one additional period for up to 7 days, contingent upon approval from the state's health authority. This is not a 7-day open and 7-day closed opportunity for facilities to take advantage of, but as mentioned earlier, it could be one of those areas that is a work in progress because this particular area has already undergone a major metamorphosis. This actually came about because a discussion draft returned to us last fall provided for 30 days of pausing essential caregivers. No structure, no conditions, no constraints at all. And it defeated the entire purpose of having a bill. And as we've witnessed how rapidly people decline in isolation, we just did not see the point of even having a bill with a provision like that in there. So we went through some very precarious days when we were uncertain if we would have a bill because we rejected so very much of that draft, including that 30-day clause. Now, for context, we have this clause in our state bill in Texas. And in our almost 4,000 facilities, we have 1,200 nursing homes, 2,000-ish assisted living facilities, 780 something intermediate care facilities for people with intellectual disabilities. Those almost 4,000 facilities, since our bill was passed in 2021, only 4 facilities out of those 4,000 have ever been given permission to use this clause. And in our state, remember, assisted living facilities fall under these guidelines. So that's 4 times in 3 years in almost 4 facilities is a very difficult clause for a facility to abuse. We do want to make sure that we're looking at this very carefully. So like I said, this is one of those areas that could be a work in progress. Okay, next slide. It was the desire of Senator Cornyn that this be a condition of the bill for 2 reasons. He wanted to make sure that states retain authority when possible. And it was his contention that enforcement and survey authority at the federal level could be way too slow and cumbersome and possibly unable to meet the other terms of the bill. So under this section, enforcement and survey authority rests with the state's agencies. Complaints for noncompliance begin at the state agency, which we're hoping provides quicker response than filing initial complaints with HHS or CMS. This helps maintain the state's authority. It also helps minimize conflicts with any existing or future state rules and regulations. Like we've said several times, I've said this already, the bill is broad so that state bills that exist already fit within it, and so that any future bills will fit within that. Next slide, Carrie. And Carrie, I'm seeing notes, someone's having trouble seeing slides, but I don't think that's you. Okay. We should be on slide 22, Carrie.
That's what I was just going to ask you. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. Final rule on the appeals process. HHS has 2 years to finalize the rule on the appeals process. And I was told, oh, that's excessive. No, that's standard. We were told that this is the standard time frame and normal procedure, and it's not something we have a whole lot of say over when HHS develops a rule. The goal is making sure that the appeals process is as quick as possible, does not create unnecessary processes that slow the return of an essential caregiver into the building, and that it's not a process that can be challenged. So that's why it's designed the way it is. We want to make sure that HHS does this right, and that this appeals process actually withstands any challenges that might be given to it. Okay, next slide. All right. And then non-compliance. One of the major concerns, again, this came from my senator, was that the penalty needed to be defined and not something vague or overly subjective. He was concerned that it could be mild during one administration, extreme during another administration. I mean, these legislators are very cognizant of, you know, some of the political discord that goes on. So it was important that the bill have a number and amount that demonstrates how seriously we take violations. So they put that cap at $5,000, but they wanted it to be a cap so that it is consistent. So we don't have like an outrageous bill for an outrageous fine for, you know, one non-compliance and a really, you know, small for another. It's difficult to try to anticipate a world the bill operates under without looking back at the pandemic we just lived through. However, it's also important that we recognize that this bill applies to all potential emergencies, not just the pandemic.